Hi everybody, I'm Bear and this is Bookies. I want to take a quick minute to thank all of you for tuning in and watching these videos. I really appreciate it. It's a very small channel and we're seeing some incremental growth, but I want you to know that I get really excited and happy every time I see that somebody's watched one of the videos, so thank you very much. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the novel Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I'm giving it 4.5 stars. It's an excellent novel, and so let's get into the details. The novel is a literary fiction written from the first person perspective of Joan Goodwin. Joan is an astrophysicist who was given the opportunity to enter into the NASA space program. And by doing that, she would be one of the first female astronauts and one of the first astronauts in total to participate in the space shuttle program. The novel is set against the backdrop and challenges and social climate of the 1980s. To that end, it highlights the male-dominated fields of mathematics and the sciences and the societal pressures faced by women, including to hide same-sex orientation in order to maintain their careers. The novel presents two themes. The first is the space program itself. It's that curious amalgamation of the everlasting quest for knowledge about the depths of space, the wonder of the scope and breadth of the beauty of it all, and the bravery of those who undertake the bold adventure to go into space. I mean, imagine for yourself the sheer fortitude of those willing to breach the heavens, the bravery and courage of an individual that's willing to be placed between two bombs in order to be launched into space and inner space traveling at 17,000 miles per hour. It's incredible. And so the novel presents a theme of bravery and courage. And they're two different things, right? Bravery is essentially being unafraid of things that others are afraid of. But courage is something to where you're afraid, but you undertake the endeavor anyhow, despite the fear. So the question is, which is the greater of the two? And I think we all know people who are brave, these people that are reckless and endangering life and limb. However, I would argue that's a characteristic that they're born with. The person that fears but engages anyhow, that's a person of iron. And that is exactly what you're presented with when you read this particular novel. And if space exploration sounds exciting, it is, but because of the courage of those who undertake it. And Jenkins establishes that theme quite well. She presents in vivid detail the training in the astronaut program at NASA, whether it be in flight or in mock-ups, as they anticipate everything that could possibly go wrong on the space shuttle. And I think it takes true artistry as an author to grab the reader, engage the reader, and bring them into that training and flight experience as if the reader is actually there. And I think you get a sense of that as you read this particular novel. Truth be told, I think this novel would have been excellent if it just focused on Joan's progress through the space program and her endeavor to enter space. Those aspects show great respect to the sciences. It shows great respect to the courage and strength that it takes to be an astronaut. But it also shows the great strength exhibited by the female characters in this novel, Vanessa, Joan, and Lydia, as they try to break that glass ceiling and actually be co-equal members in the space program with the men. However, Jenkins doesn't quite leave it there. Our second theme is the interplay between the characters in the book and the NASA space program. I'll start with the relationship between the candidates who are becoming and do become astronauts. One thing that surprised me in this novel is the relative lack of sexism presented. And you would have expected the novel to present maybe a little bit more sexism as it relates to talking down to the women or thinking that the women don't belong in the space program. But Jenkins doesn't present that with regard to the characters that are representing astronauts. Um, those characters befriend and nurture the female candidates into the space program. So I found that a really nice touch. Even with that support, the weight of expectations on behalf of the female astronauts is overwhelming. And what I mean by that is essentially every one of the female characters in this novel that are in the space program implicitly understand that they're the prototype, they're the first, and their failure could result in women being barred from the space program, or at maybe the best case scenario, if they fail, is that there's a delay in allowing more women in the space program. Jenkins does an excellent job of showing those expectations, showing the pressure on the female astronauts. She makes it quite well understood to the reader that their failure will validate the critics. Maybe, just maybe, what matters is the skills of the individuals and not their gender. We know this to be true, but I appreciate Jenkins raising the issue plainly, addressing it without sexism towards men or malice. Let the best serve, simple as that. And having addressed the space program itself, I don't want to spend too much time on that because I think the strength of the novel is once again in the relationships expressed. So let's return to the person of Joan. Joan is multi-talented. She plays classical piano. She's an amateur portraitist. She runs marathons. She's a professor. She's all these things, and it sounds nice, right? But Joan's family life is rather complicated, and this is best exhibited in a relationship with her sister Barbara. Barbara is presented in stark contrast to Joan. We have a strong sense that Joan's parents preferred Barbara. So, for example, when Joan would suggest something as a child, her parents may reply, well, Barbara may not like that, so we'll see. And so that dynamic creates a sense of entitlement on the part of Barbara, which now as Barbara and Joan are adults, you could see that entitlement play out during the novel. Not just entitlement, however, but Barbara belittles Joan for not being in a relationship, not desiring marriage, for not wanting a beautiful home, and all the things that Barbara wants. Barbara gives Joan backhanded compliments, such as, if only I could find something to love half as much as you love looking up at the stars. So she's trivializing Joan's status as an astrophysicist, and she's not loving her as a sister should. And despite that condescension, Joan loves Barbara. And the link between the two is Barbara's daughter, Frances. Jenkins does an excellent job of describing the loving and nurturing relationship between Joan Goodwin and her niece, Frances. And drawing on that sense of entitlement, Barbara feels like Joan should come and move to her so she can care for Frances. Although Barbara knows better, she nonetheless treats Joan as though Frances were her responsibility. Despite Barbara's entitlement, Jenkins presents Joan as undertaking it all because she loves Frances. I think the character of a person is rightly judged by their love as a parent. On this level, we're invited to judge Barbara harshly, although her faults are born from great insecurity. In contrast, we appreciate Joan even more. Why? Because Joan takes delight in being able to show people what they should love about themselves, and she does that with Frances. As a parent myself, I'm struck by the simplicity of it all, and it's kind of best expressed in this quote from the novel. But to love Frances was to always be saying goodbye to the girl Frances used to be and falling in love again with the girl Frances was becoming. That is definitely the parental experience, and I've experienced that sentiment several times in my own life. There's nothing more pure than the love of a parent for their child. For example, I remember one day I was taking my own son Alex to school, and he fell asleep against the passenger side window. And I remember looking at him and just thinking to myself, he's so beautiful. And that day, Alex would interact with several people, and then he would come home. And with the exception of his mother, I know that nobody looked at my son that way like I did. And I don't know, it's kind of a sentimental story, but it's true. Just expressing that love of a parent for a child for who they are. And I still feel that very same way about him. And so the point of the story is that I kind of know what I'm talking about. Jenkins does an excellent job of really engaging in the love story between Joan and her niece, Frances. Lastly, the cover to the novel says this is a love story, and that reference isn't to the love story between Joan and her niece, Frances. It's speaking of a different love story, and I'm not going to spoil it for you by giving details about how that love story occurs and who it occurs with. I think that would wreck the novel for you, so I'm just going to speak in broad brushes about sexuality. Jenkins presents Joan as trying to cope with the sadness that she always feels when she thinks about marriage, any marriage. And that sadness isn't as a result of any external influence, such as her career. It isn't because she doesn't have a strong appreciation for marriage as an institution. And it isn't because she disdains the institution of marriage. It's none of those things. It's simply because Joan isn't aware of her sexual preference until later in the novel. And here, Jenkins does an admirable job, I think, of exploring the tension of being in a homosexual relationship while in the space program. There's absolutely no doubt that in the 1980s, being in a homosexual relationship would have resulted in a revocation of your security clearance. And without a security clearance, you can't be in the space program. So Jenkins does a really excellent job of exploring that tension as Joan is essentially trying to hide um, her relationship with another woman, even when some of the other astronauts figure it out. And one astronaut, Griff, basically says, "Hey, I understand, I get it, and I've got your back." And her reply is, "I have no idea what you're talking about." She's trying to preserve her career goals against the backdrop of probably the most important thing you'll ever engage in, which is relationship. And here I think we can appreciate Jenkins' treatment of the subject. Joan is a person entitled to love and respect. And I think we often tend to categorize people and put them in little boxes, right? That person is white, that person is black, this person's a Jew, that person is Catholic. Whatever it may be, we tend to put somebody in a box and then define them by that box. Um, but we always have to remember that that's a construct. And we have to remember to give the person the dignity of having a name and a soul. Joan's a person. That's the bottom line. She's a person that happens to be an astronaut, a person that happens to enjoy classical piano, a person that runs marathons, a person that is essentially a surrogate parent for her niece, Frances. And she also happens to be in love. At least that's how I feel about those kinds of issues. I think Jenkins presents a love story of a person, not a stereotype, a person, Joan. And Joan is such a well-crafted character in this novel. If she were real, I think we would all love and admire the person that Joan is. And my only slight critique of the novel was the pacing as the relationship started to begin with the other female. And what I mean by that is it's not a negative thing necessarily, because I was really enjoying the space program material. Jenkins did such a good job presenting that I felt like, yeah, I was kind of in the space program. It was excellent. And so when, you have to take some time to craft a backdrop for any relationship, um, and so for me, it drug a little bit, because I was either wanting to go back to the space program or let's get on with the relationship aspect. But as I progressed in the novel, that feeling went away rather quickly for me. Now that I can look back on it in hindsight, I think the pacing was actually very good. And so I want to bring it back to the two themes, the professional life and the private life. And Jenkins does a phenomenal job at interplaying the two. So, you get a little break from the professional life when it goes to the private life, and vice versa. And because that's real life, because we all have, a professional life or a career or a job, and we have a private life, that's kind of the way things work with us. So it's really easy to engage with the novel as it goes back and forth. And with that, I'll conclude. The novel is certainly a worthy read. It's incredibly well written. The characters are engaging, and more importantly, I think they're real to life. So I highly recommend it. I'm going to give this one 4.5 stars out of 5. And if you like this content, please remember to like and subscribe. As I stated at the beginning, I really appreciate it anytime somebody spends any time watching one of my videos. And I really enjoy the thought that a novel I might recommend to you, you might read, because I've recommended it. So coming back to Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid, I highly recommend it. I hope you read it. Have a great day, and God bless.